All right, welcome back to Doctrines 3 as we continue on our study of angels, church, and end times. We're going to be talking about a few more things about angels today before we really get into Satan and demons in the next couple of weeks. Really want to get into the different kinds of angels and the different descriptions of angels that we see and a little more specifics. Last week we looked at some of the generic or general speaking about angels, who they are, what they are all about. But let's talk about some of the specifics. Let's get into the different kinds of angels, the different named angels. And in this video, I really want to get into some of those different kinds of creatures that many times are associated with angels, namely the seraphim, the cherubim, and the living creatures. Let's talk a little bit about seraphim first. In Isaiah chapter 6, verses 2 and 3, you guys are familiar with that passage. Isaiah comes before the temple, comes before the throne of God, which is in the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem. And there he encounters the seraphim. And here's the description that Isaiah gives. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to one another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is filled with his glory. So right away, we see a couple of really interesting things about these creatures, the seraphim. We see, and although this description is quite short in Isaiah's prophecy here, but in this vision, we see that they have 6 wings. And it's interesting because with these 6 wings, they're covering and then flying. The 2 wings, of course, one on each side, covering their face. 2, they're covering their feet, and 2, they're flying with them. We're not told how many there are. We're not told what their feet look like. We're not told what their head or face looks like because they're being covered by wings. But what we do see about them here is that they're calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is filled with his glory. So let's break that down just a little bit here. First of all, the word seraphim means burning ones. It's actually the same word that's used in Numbers chapter 23 to describe the burning serpents or fiery serpents that were biting the Israelites. And when Moses fashioned a fiery serpent and a bronze serpent for them to look at, those fiery serpents, that term there, fiery ones, is used of the seraphim. Now, we're not exactly sure what that means. Probably in Numbers means poisonous and fire as in burning sensation. But in Isaiah here, most likely it means burning as in bright and shining. Right? And they're pictured as surrounding the throne of God. In Isaiah chapter 6, verse 2, we see that throne of God. That's the Holy of Holies. That's the Ark of the Covenant. The mercy seat is called the throne of God in that Holy of Holies. They're described as having 6 wings. Faces are covered. Their feet are covered. And so we don't get to see those. And in that threefold proclamation, we hear that holy, holy, holy. Now in Hebrew, when they wanted to make something great or greatest, then they would just simply repeat the word. Whereas we would say that God is holy, holier, and holiest, we would just simply say the holiest one. But instead, that's the holy, holy, holy. That's how in Hebrew you would describe something as being the most holy or extremely perfectly holy. In fact, it's quite interesting because in the temple itself, there was the holy place, which was the first section of the temple, and then the second section of the temple, where the Ark of the Covenant was called the Holy of Holies, using a twofold holy, meaning it is holier and the most holy place on earth that it can be. But when God is described and we're looking at a heavenly vision, then it's holy, 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 the supreme holiness of God. And we see them located in this heavenly vision of the physical place of the Holy of Holies, the throne of God. Let's talk a little bit then about the cherubim. And the cherubim are interesting because we see them probably most of all throughout Scripture, mostly in the Old Testament. And as they're described, they're usually considered to be the highest order or class of angel. Now, it's interesting because the word cherubim does not have a translation. We don't have a word that's been given to us to properly translate the word cherubim. Some have suggested mighty ones or strong ones, but those words are not do not specifically translate the word cherubim. And also, by the way, with seraphim and cherubim, the I am at the end is the plural of the word, and so a singular one would be a cherub, or the cherubim, or sometimes cherubim. Or if you wanted to make that a little more English-sized or anglicized, then you would use cherubs and seraphs. But those that's what the I am there is plural for cherub. Their main purpose and activity might be summarized in this way. They are proclaimers and protectors of God's glorious presence, His sovereignty, and, check this out, His holiness. It kind of sounds a little familiar with what it is perhaps that the seraphim were doing as they called out to one another, holy, holy, holy. We see them in Genesis chapter 3. We see a cherub standing at the gate of the Garden of Eden and preventing sinful man from entering into that holy place because man had sinned. We see them in Exodus chapter 25. The cherubim, interestingly enough, are over the mercy seat in the Holy of Holies. We also see in Exodus and also again in 1 Kings as Solomon is designing the temple that the curtain itself that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies had cherubim two cherubim on the curtain itself, and this is interesting because the wings, the tips of their wings were touching one another on the middle, and then also touching the two sides of the temple. Also, remember in Exodus 25, their wings as they covered up the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat, their wings were touching in order to completely cover. Let's look at their description. We see this description in Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 4 through 14. Now, I want you to be very careful with this because in Ezekiel chapter 1, they're described as having a different name. When we get to Ezekiel chapter 10, we see in Ezekiel chapter 10, the creatures that are described in chapter 1 are then renamed and called cherubim. The cherubim are, in fact, the living creatures that are described in Ezekiel chapter 1. Now let's read through this. It says, "As I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness all around it, and fire flashing forth continually, and in the midst of the fire, as it were, a gleaming metal. And in the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures." And again, the word living creature here just simply means creatures that are alive and moving. There's no actual description of that with their name there. And this was their appearance. They had a human likeness, but each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, their soles of their feet were like the soles of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on the 4 sides, they had human hands, and the 4 had their faces and their wings thus. Their wings touched one another. Notice that with the cherubim there. Each one of them went straight forward without turning as they went. That's going to be interesting when we get to our next passage. As for the likeness of their faces, each had a human face. The 4 had the face of a lion on the right side, and on the 4 had the face of an ox on the left side, and the 4 had the face of an eagle, presumably on the back. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out above. Each creature had 2 wings, each of which touched the wing of another, while 2 covered their bodies. So their 2 wings are touching one another, and the other 2 wings out of the 4 are covering their bodies. Verse 12, "And each went straight forward, wherever the Spirit would go. They went without turning as they went. As for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches moving to and fro from the living creatures. among the living creatures. And the fire was bright, and out of their fire went forth lightning, and the living creatures darted to and fro like the appearance of a flash of lightning. So a couple of things I want you to notice about the cherubim here. First, they're attending the glory of God, the holiness of God. They had an extraordinary appearance with the four faces, that of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. But notice that all four of them, there were four cherubim, and all four of them had all four faces. Each one, the man facing forward, the lion and ox facing to the sides, the eagle to the back. But also remember, they didn't turn as they moved. So as Ezekiel is watching them, as they move from one place to another, as they go around, they're moving, but they're not turning as they go. So Ezekiel is able to see all four sides of their heads, and is able to get that 360-degree view of them like that. So they had the four wings, but they also had feet like calves. Like a calf of a cow, gleaming like burnished bronze. So again, here you see their feet. So notice in the seraphim, they have 6 wings, 2 of which are covering their feet, so we don't get to see their feet. But here there's 4 wings, and their feet are uncovered, and so are their faces, by the way. They are located again. In Ezekiel's vision, we see comparing Ezekiel 1 with Ezekiel 10, which is a parallel passage there, that where they are is in the Holy of Holies, surrounding the throne of God. Sounds familiar, right? And of course, what are they doing? They're attending to the very glory of God, as God is preparing for judgment. Finally, here we have the living creatures. We see them in Revelation chapter 4, verses 6 through 8. Let's read that passage. And around the throne, on each side of the throne, are 4 living creatures, full of eyes in front and behind. The first living creature like a lion, the second living creature like an ox, the third living creature with the face of a man, and the fourth living creature like an eagle in flight. Notice something about that? Interesting, the 4 faces, only here John is describing them as having the 4 face, each one having the 4 faces. And the 4 living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes all around and within, and day and night they never cease to say, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. So notice this again. We see these living creatures, same words used in Ezekiel chapter 1 to describe these with the 4 faces, although Ezekiel sees that each one had all 4 faces. John describes each one as only having 1 face, but if you remember, they were not turning as they were going, whereas John is seeing them in a static image where he can only see one side of each living creature. But also notice, what are they saying? Holy, 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 just like the seraphim in Isaiah. And you say, wait, don't they have 6 wings? But also look again, what are they covering? And what are they not covering? These angelic creatures who seem to be involved with the revealing of the glory of God and His omniscience, His omnipresence, His omnipotence. We see them here in Revelation 4. We see them in Ezekiel 1. We'll see them again in Revelation chapter 6, although not as much description there. But notice here they have 6 wings. They're not covering anything. In fact, not only are they not covering anything, we see that their bodies are full of eyes. That's a part of the description that Ezekiel missed. And Ezekiel chapter 10 reveals that these are, in fact, the cherubim. Well, how do we account for, I honestly believe that it is entirely possible that the cherubim, the seraphim, and the living creatures, when we compare and contrast these 3 passages of these heavenly visions by these 3 different prophets, that they are in fact the exact same creature, just described slightly differently because of the different visions. Well, how do we compensate for, or how do we harmonize the differences like the differences in number of wings or the fact that Isaiah does not describe their faces. Well, number one, we have to remember Isaiah did not see their faces because they were covered with wings. We also see that he didn't see their feet, whereas Ezekiel describes their feet. But both Ezekiel and Isaiah indicate that their bodies were covered by wings. Presumably the wings covering the feet would have also covered the body. And so John sees that they're not covering anything and reveals that they're full of eyes. Well, again, how do we compensate for the number of wings? Well, that's actually quite easy, because when anything has wings and those wings are folded in and not being used, many times it's very difficult to see those wings against the body, particularly if something has more than one set of wings. Like, for instance, a beetle. When you see a beetle walking around on the ground, you don't see any wings at all. Instead, you see a shell. And you don't know that when they open up that shell, not only is that shell actually wings themselves, but the under wings are right there. So anything that we see in nature that has multiple sets of wings, when those wings are not being used, those wings can easily be folded and tucked out of sight, which would easily compensate for the differences in Ezekiel describing them having 4 wings, and Isaiah and John both describing them with 6 wings. Well, how do we compensate for the names Seraphim, Cherubim, and living creatures? Now notice, cherubim is untranslatable, and it is a name that they're given throughout the rest of Scripture. The seraphim, the word seraphim, is more of a description. They are the burning ones. Isaiah did not give us a full description of did not give us their name. He just simply said, and the burning ones were flying around the throne. And the same thing with John and at the beginning of Ezekiel. And I guess we can also use this because Ezekiel initially calls them living creatures in chapter 1, but then in chapter 10 calls them the cherubim. So again, not necessarily a problem that they're called different things. And ultimately, there's no difference at all. I believe that that all 3 of these visions are describing the same creatures with the same purpose. Really quickly, before we finish this video, the question is what is that purpose? And ultimately, we see in the harmonization of these 3 passages that they are surrounding the throne of God. They are protecting the holiness and the glory of God and proclaiming the glory of God. But also notice they're not protecting God's holiness from sin. Instead, they're protecting us from God's holiness. They're proclaiming out and shouting out as Isaiah approaches the throne. They're saying, "Holy, holy, holy! Beware! You're coming into the holy presence of God. Understand that you cannot come into the presence of God, see His face, and live." And so ultimately, they're covering the holiness not for God's sake, but for ours. And so I always find this study fascinating. I hope you did as well. And I also pray that as you're challenged with some of perhaps your previous thinking on these things, that you would look further into these texts and just really dig in deep into the language and all of that as well. All right, that's all we have for this video. We'll see you in the next one.